Hello, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Hidden Risk in Early Development, Why Programs Lose Momentum, presented by Dr. Vince Clinical Research and Fierce Biotech. My name is Janelle Karimoto, and I will be your moderator. Before we begin, here are a few quick housekeeping items. To learn more about our speakers, please visit the speaker bio window. Additional resources can be found in the handouts window. If you accidentally close the window, you can reopen it by clicking its name in the top navigation bar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours. And finally, we will host a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. Feel free to submit your questions at any time using the Submit Questions window. Today's discussion will explore how continuity in project leadership, study management, and clinical monitoring influences execution quality, decision confidence, and program momentum in early phase development. From first in human through proof of concept, development is a continuous scientific narrative, yet operational handoffs often fragment that process. To discuss this topic further, we're joined by a group of speakers who bring deep operational experience across early phase clinical development. They will share perspectives on how continuity preserves institutional knowledge, reduces execution friction, and helps programs maintain forward momentum. All right, well, first we'll hear from Beth Williams, Executive Director, Clinical Trial Services with Dr. Vince Clinical Research. Beth, please go ahead.
Thanks, Janelle. Today, I would like to talk about an ugly industry reality. Early phase development often gets treated as transactional, but in practice, it's strategic. Leadership and project management continuity across early phase programs has a disproportionate impact on speed, quality, and sponsor confidence. Continuity is a delivery infrastructure, not a nice to have. It allows learning and momentum to compound instead of resetting at every transition. From first in human through SAD, MAD, phase 1B, and into proof of concept, this is not a series of independent studies. It's one continuous development journey. Each protocol exists because of what we learned in the one before. Scientifically and strategically, this is one narrative, yet operationally, sponsors often experience something very different. They see new project managers, new operational leads, sometimes even new business units as the programs move forward. These transitions often occur exactly when the program is getting more complex, more valuable, and more decision intensive. The result is artificial fragmentation of a process that should be continuous. This fragmentation doesn't only happen within organizations. It also happens when programs transition from one CRO to another as they move from early phase development into late phase development. That transition may make sense commercially or structurally, but from a continuity perspective, it represents a full reset of institutional memory. New leadership, new monitoring structure, new governance processes, new interpretation of historical risk. Every leadership reset forces the program to briefly operate in reconstruction mode instead of forward momentum mode. And in early phase development, reconstruction interrupts trajectory. Today, I want to explore why continuity of leadership in early phase development is not a preference, but a prerequisite for preserving momentum, execution quality, and confident decision-making. So what gets lost in handoff? It's not just time, it's context. What's lost is the reasoning behind decision-making, the sponsor's risk tolerance, the regulatory nuances, and the operational trade-offs that were consciously made earlier in the program. When leadership resets, teams are forced to reconstruct the narrative instead of building on it, and that has consequences. Decisions that were previously resolved get revisited. Planning becomes more conservative, amendments take longer, and sponsors then need to increase their oversight due to the reduced confidence. Teams end up spending time rediscovering rather than advancing. The result is not a project collapse, but it does create friction, and friction interrupts momentum. In early phase development, where studies build sequentially and timelines are extremely tight, that loss of momentum compounds quickly. That brings me to the role of project leader as the program's memory. So if those handoffs interrupt momentum, then continuity can preserve it. If you experience a long tenured project leader on your program, they become that living memory of the program. They don't just remember what was decided, they remember why it was decided. They recall what trade-offs were made and what risks were consciously accepted. That context changes how the next study is designed and executed. In reality, it becomes risk being managed cumulatively, not reactively. Those planning cycles shorten, amendments become faster, and decisions are made with confidence instead of reanalysis. As you can see, that continuity preserves velocity. Each successive study starts from a higher baseline rather than restarting from zero. Momentum is preserved. Within the continuity resourcing model, the project leader is not simply administering studies. They're acting as the execution architect across the molecule's early life. They are the continuity steward that keeps the program in forward motion. When continuity is allowed to preserve momentum, then we aren't forced to depend on one individual's effort alone. So what do we normally see? When we look at how early phase studies are often structured in the industry, it typically follows a study execution resourcing model. And what I mean by that is teams are staffed study by study. Contracts are phase-based. Success is basically measured by delivering each protocol on time. But early phase development doesn't behave modularly. So why are we resourcing it this way? A truly efficient early resourcing model should mean longitudinal program leadership. The same leadership team guiding the molecule across first in human, SAD, MAD, and into phase 1B and proof of concept. This integrated resourcing strategy creates context across all of the functional disciplines. That means decisions are cumulative rather than being rediscovered. And to put it a different way, there's a simple distinction. Study execution delivers protocols. Program execution advances molecules. One resourcing strategy optimizes individual study milestone, whereas the other resourcing strategy optimizes the entire program's momentum. And once you understand that continuity can become structural, the cost of breaking it is no longer abstract, it's measurable. What I mean by that is even a well-managed leadership transition carries a cost. Typically, there's a period of revamp, realignment, and re-education that often spans several weeks as the study is getting up and going. During that time, the teams aren't just getting up to speed, they're actually reconstructing the program history. They're revalidating trust. They're revisiting decisions that were previously settled. In early development, that lost time is not neutral. It's opportunity cost to the molecule and sometimes to the company. It delays learning and increases sponsor oversight at exactly the time in that molecule's development where the program should be accelerating. The turnover doesn't just cost weeks, it interrupts the trajectory of the molecule's development. In early phase, lost momentum is often more damaging than time lost. While individual studies may appear faster in isolation, a consistent team reduces the handover friction and downtime between the phases. And this ultimately delivers the entire program to the finish line sooner. Let's discuss how continuity compounds efficiency over time. What you really want in an early phase program is for execution to get more efficient over time. With leadership continuity, each successive study benefits from the one before it. You're building on experience instead of starting over. Protocol development accelerates. Vendor and site setup models get recycled or reused. Governance gets lighter because trust already exists. And most importantly, risk management changes. Teams stop reacting to issues and start anticipating them. Execution becomes more predictable as the program advances. So continuity doesn't just prevent resets, it allows efficiency to compound. The real value of continuity is not avoiding mistakes. It's preserving forward acceleration. Momentum is cumulative. Reset is expensive. And none of this depends on individual heroics. Compounding efficiency only happens when accountability for continuity is built into the structure of how early phase programs are resourced. So what do I mean by that? When teams rotate, we all have experienced this, problems quickly become legacy issues. Decisions that were previously made become disconnected from the outcomes, and root cause ownership diffuses. The accountability narrows to individual studies rather than the program as a whole. Programs stall when ownership resets. On the other side, when leadership does persist, the opposite happens. Those decisions retain memory. The trade-offs that were made have owners. Quality becomes cumulative because the same team lives with the downstream consequences of their earlier choices. When accountability persists, momentum persists. That's what true program level accountability looks like, and it only exists when continuity is built into the resourcing structure. If program leadership sets the architecture, continuity only delivers value if it translates into day-to-day operational control. And that is where study management becomes critical. With that in mind, I'll transition it back to Janelle to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Beth. I now have the pleasure of handing it over to Crystal Sunikin, Senior Study Manager at DVCR, to speak about how continuity at the study manager level protects protocol integrity, site performance, and execution quality across the life of a program. Crystal, over to you.
Thanks, Janelle. I want to focus on the continuity role that sponsors experience every single day, and that is study management. This is the operational nerve center of the study where protocol requirements, site performance, and day-to-day execution converge. In practice, the study manager is the operational counterpart to the project manager inside the clinic. This is typically the person sponsors interact with the most frequently. They own the day-to-day operational flow of the study. They are coordinating across the lab, pharmacy, safety, investigators, and site staff, ensuring that all moving parts stay aligned. Most importantly, they translate protocol design in real-world execution, minute by minute, patient by patient. This is where strategy either holds or breaks under operational pressure. Next slide. This is one of those roles where continuity delivers immediate, tangible value. A study manager who has been with the program understands the intent behind the protocol, not just the procedures. They know where the operational trade-offs were made and where the study is most vulnerable. They also have insight into how the clinic actually runs the study, what works smoothly, what creates friction, and where issues tend to emerge. The depth of the context leads to faster issue resolution and fewer execution surprises. With rotation, that insight disappears. You revert to managing from documentation rather than experience. And in early phase studies, that difference is felt quickly by sponsors. Next slide, please. Every time this role turns over, operational memory resets. Even a highly capable replacement needs time to absorb site dynamics, protocol nuances, escalation patterns, and sponsor preferences. That ramp-up period is unavoidable. During that period, friction increases. Questions that once had immediate answers require rediscovery. Some inconsistencies appear, escalations take longer. It really shows up as a major failure. It shows up as noise, delays, rework, minor execution drifts, and in early phase studies, that operational noise matters. So the question becomes, is continuity left to chance, or is it structurally built into the operating model? Next slide, please. At Dr. Vince Clinical Research, study management continuity is not incidental, it's intentional. Each program has a dedicated study manager who remains with the study across cohorts and phases. There has been zero turnover. Study management is directly integrated with project leadership and clinical monitoring. Execution, oversight, and decision-making operate as a single system rather than separate silos. The result is a hyper-responsive model where issues are addressed quickly because context is preserved. Continuity is built into the structure, not dependent on luck and when that structure is in place. Sponsors experience the difference almost immediately. Next slide, please. If continuity is working, this is where sponsors notice it first. Questions are answered quickly because context does not need to be rebuilt. Fewer items fall through the cracks because the same leadership sees patterns over time. Clinic execution becomes more predictable. There are fewer surprises. And as programs move from first in human into expansion in phase 2, sponsor confidence increases because the same team owns both early decisions and downstream outcomes. Continuity becomes visible as stability. Study management protects execution inside the clinic. The next layer of continuity protects what ultimately matters most, the data. Clinical monitoring is where operational consistency translates directly into data quality, deviation control, and early risk detection. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Chris Hardage, Director of Clinical Trial Services, will now speak about continuity from the monitoring perspective. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Janelle. It's a pleasure to speak with everyone today regarding clinical monitoring for those joining online. We know with clinical monitoring, as programs move from first in human into expanded later phase studies, complexity increases. Monitoring continuity ensures oversight evolves with that complexity rather than restarting with each phase of the clinical program. Next slide, please. So next, I want to frame monitoring continuity, not just as a staffing preference, but as a core execution and quality strategy in early phase development. Clinical monitoring is not simply passive oversight. It is one of the primary control systems for data quality, site performance, and safety signal detection. And the way monitoring teams are structured across phases has a much larger impact on outcomes than most organizations will acknowledge. From first in human through the SAD, MAD, and later into the phase 1B and 2A programs, this is not a series of independent studies. It's one continuous scientific learning system. Each cohort builds on the prior data. Each protocol amendment reflects prior execution, and decision quality is directly dependent on execution quality. Monitoring continuity directly influences both equally. To understand why continuity matters so much here, we have to look at where monitoring actually operates. Next slide, please. So clinical monitoring is where design intent meets real-world behavior. This is where we see how sites interpret the protocol, how data actually gets generated, how safety signals first emerge, and where operational friction begins to surface. In many ways, monitoring functions as the earliest warning system in early phase development. It is also one of the most direct levers for protecting execution quality before small issues become structural problems. Despite that critical role, industry practice often introduces discontinuity at exactly the wrong times. We've all seen it. Next slide, please. So although the science progresses continuously, clinical monitoring teams often do not. As programs move from first in human into expanded phase 1B or 2A programs, new CRAs are often introduced. Sometimes new leads as well. Site relationships effectively restart. And this typically happens exactly when the program is getting more complex and more valuable. Even experienced clinical monitors need time to relearn critical things like site workflows, protocol nuances, and historical risk areas. They also need additional time to build trust and working rhythm with site staff involved. During that ramp-up period, signal sensitivity is much lower. Subtle patterns are easier to miss by all. Issues are more likely to be identified later rather than earlier. That ramp is a hidden tax on both quality and speed. The operational implications of that reset are not theoretical. They are very measurable. And next slide, please. As we see across the industry, it is commonplace for a new CRA to require 1 or 2 monitoring visits to reach peak effectiveness. In adaptive early phase studies, that's not just an efficiency issue. One missed pattern or one late discovered signal can directly affect the full development program decisions. Longitudinal CRAs do not just conduct visits, they see critical patterns. They recognize recurring deviations, persistent training gaps, fragile workflows, and protocol ambiguities. They understand investigator oversight styles and site-specific behaviors and how to navigate them. That longitudinal insight allows monitoring to shift from reactive issue identification to preventive intervention. That is a structural advantage for all. And when that pattern recognition is preserved over time, monitoring becomes something more powerful than just compliance. Next slide, please. So this is where monitoring continuity compounds. Instead of resetting with each cohort or phase of the clinical program, execution improves incrementally. Each cohort runs cleaner than the last. Repeat findings decline. Data stabilizes earlier, and database locks accelerate. Monitoring evolves from a compliance safeguard into a performance optimization feature. Quality becomes cumulative rather than cyclical. That level of continuity does not happen by accident. It requires intentional structure and design. Next slide, please. Again, continuity in monitoring is not accidental. It requires 3 distinct structural elements. First, monitoring leadership structure. Clinical monitoring leadership and escalation must persist across phases so that risk interpretation remains consistent. Secondly, operational continuity. A core monitoring presence must carry forward so historical risk memory compounds rather than resets. And third, controlled scalability. As programs expand, scale must be layered onto a stable foundation already established so that signal detection sensitivity is preserved throughout. When continuity is designed into the structure, clinical monitoring becomes longitudinal risk control rather than episodic oversight. These are not operational preferences, they are quality system design decisions. And when continuity is structural, inspection readiness is not something you prepare for. It is the way you operate. Next slide, please. So as to inspection readiness, it's not just about clean data sets. It is about whether the team can clearly explain how the data was generated, overseen, and corrected over time. Regulators look for consistency. They look for evidence of pattern recognition, early intervention, and structured oversight. Stable monitoring teams always work to catch issues earlier because they recognize deviation trends, cite behaviors before they escalate. In addition, they maintain a coherent narrative. Decisions are contextualized. Risk assessments become traceable. Corrective actions align with historical findings. In our case, the clinical monitoring team has importantly had zero turnover since its inception over 4 years ago. That stability translates into predictable oversight and fewer late-stage surprises. Again, team stability is not just optics, it is part of the quality system. Next slide. So the sponsor conversation is always evolving. Traditionally, the sponsor question has been, how many CRAs can you staff? But the more important question is, will the same team own my data as my program scales? Capacity still matters, but capacity is not the differentiator in early phase. What matters is continuity and ownership. As early phase studies move into phase 1B and 2A programs, the data becomes more consequential. Regulatory visibility increases, strategic decisions carry more weight. Sponsors want to know that oversight does not reset at that critical inflection point. Clinical monitoring continuity ultimately is what protects these three things: data integrity, confidence in emerging signals, and the quality of development decisions. That is what sustained ownership enables. Next slide. Janelle, thank you for the opportunity to present the clinical monitoring piece today, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. To close, I will now hand it back to Beth Williams to discuss why phase 1B and 2A are where continuity creates the greatest strategic advantage, and how focused early phase specialization makes that continuity possible. Beth, go ahead.
Thank you, Janelle. The transition from phase 1B and phase 2A is the inflection point. It's at this point in the molecule's journey that continuity can influence whether the program accelerates into proof of concept or stalls under complexity. This is because complexity increases sharply at this stage in development. It's where you have multiple cohorts, dose expansions, adaptive designs, and often multi-site or multi-country study execution. It's also where decisions become harder to reverse and more visible across the organization. The cost of relearning the program is much higher. Losing context here doesn't just slow execution, it affects governance confidence and strategic decision-making. That's why the value of continuity multiplies in phase 1B and 2A. With continuity, there are fewer surprises, faster pivots, and greater confidence at the sponsor governance level. If phase 1B and 2A are where continuity matters most, the next logical question is, which operating models are actually built to sustain continuity under that level of program complexity? At this point, it's worth asking, why isn't continuity the standard operating model in the industry? Let's be honest, continuity is hard to achieve. Continuity exists more often in some CRO models than others. Focused early phase CRO models are designed specifically around first-in-human through proof of concept studies. Their leadership teams are structured to stay with the molecule. Accountability is set at a program level, and continuity is supported by that resourcing design. On the other hand, those broader all things to all CRO models are optimized for something else. They're optimized for coverage and scale. That works really well in later development. But in early phase, it often means leadership rotates by phase or function. So continuity really depends on individual effort than structure in that broader CRO model. The key point here isn't that one model is better and the other is worse. It's really that continuity really reliably emerges when the operating model is designed to support it. When continuity is structurally supported, tenure stops being a marketing claim and becomes a delivery signal. At an industry level, tenure matters not because it looks good on a slide, but because it's predictive. We all know that high turnover correlates with inconsistent execution, heavier reliance on process to compensate for lost context, and repeated knowledge lost. On the other hand, long tenured teams carry pattern recognition. They recognize early warning signs, they avoid repeating past mistakes, and they navigate ambiguity more effectively because they've seen how programs evolve over time. In the continuity first resourcing model, stability doesn't happen by accident. Instead, that ownership persists across the molecule's early life. Handoffs are minimized and accountability is sustained over time because that is the core plan around which we resource those programs. The result of that resourcing strategy is delivery stability, and that emerges by design, not by chance. If tenure is a meaningful delivery signal, then it changes the question sponsors should be asking. The question isn't simply whether a CRO can run the next study. It's whether the same CRO leadership team will support the molecule when it matters most. Continuity is not theoretical. It is structural alignment. Executive leadership should remain connected to the program, providing consistent vision and governance. The program director stays accountable across phases. They are the program memory and preserve context, which accelerates execution. Study management maintains operational ownership, while clinical monitoring maintains longitudinal oversight of data and site performance. The same leadership team supports the molecule from first in human through expansion. That type of continuity creates a closed feedback loop. Strategic decisions reflect operational reality. Operational adjustments reflect monitoring insight. Monitoring insight reflects historical pattern recognition. The program does not reset as it scales. It matures. That is what structural continuity looks like in practice. Sponsors should begin to evaluate potential CROs through that lens, because if continuity is what protects execution, quality, and decision integrity, then the questions sponsors ask of their CROs must evolve as well. The better sponsor question is this: will the same leadership team support this molecule at proof of concept? As we've emphasized, early phase is not a sequence of transactions. It's a compounding development arc. I'll echo Chris's earlier statement. Of course, CRO capacity matters, but ownership matters more. Because when this molecule reaches phase 1B and proof of concept, the data is more consequential, the visibility is higher, and the cost of errors increases. Sponsors should not just be buying execution. They need to buy the continuity of judgment, continuity of accountability, and preserved momentum. In early phase development, molecules do not scale by accident. They scale under sustained leadership.
All right, well, thank you, Beth, Crystal, and Chris for sharing your insights today. And thank you to the audience for submitting so many great questions. Feel free to continue adding questions as you think of them in the submit questions window. All right, the first question is, what actually happens when study management turns over mid-program?
Thanks, Janelle. I will take that. What actually happens when study management turns over mid-program? It causes friction, slower decisions, rediscovery of nuances, and temporary loss of operational fluency. In early phase, that friction has a multiplier effect.
All right, and it looks like this next one's going to be about clinical monitoring. Chris, how do you handle geographic expansion without losing continuity in clinical monitoring?
Thank you for that one, Janelle. As far as geographic expansion and clinical monitoring continuity, it does increase the complexity, but it does not require a total reset of leadership. The key is preserving continuity of the team by building upon the already established foundation. So what does that mean? What does it look like? I would say the same monitoring leadership remains engaged, informed, and accountable. At least one experienced clinical monitor carries forward as they have valuable legacy intel about the journey of the compound and the preferences of the study team. Historical risk patterns are actively transferred and continuity managed, not just passively documented. When new regions are added, local CRAs are then onboarded with structured context, inclusive of very important things: site risk history, protocol sensitivities, deviation patterns, and sponsor expectations. The geographic scale approach works when expansion is layered onto preserved oversight rather than replacing it. It is so important to understand the difference between documentation transfer and institutional transfer. Documentation simply memorializes what happened, but institutional continuity explains why it happened and what should be on your continuous radar to watch for next throughout study progress and expansion. So thanks again, Janelle.
Thank you to the audience. We're getting a lot of good questions. I'm going to try to combine a couple duplicates. This one's about study management. How does study management continuity affect adaptive protocol changes?
Thanks, Janelle. A study manager who has been with the program understands which protocol element caused site burden, where documentation complexity slowed flow, where lab turnaround created pressure, which operational risks were previously mitigated. I feel like that knowledge allows feasibility assessments in hours instead of days. It also reduces overcorrection. Continuity converts adaptation from disruption into iteration. Thank you.
All right, next question. Isn't it more efficient to transition programs to specialized phase 2 teams once they get bigger and complexity increases?
I'll jump in on that one, Janelle. That's a fair question, and specialization absolutely has its value. I think here the issue isn't here in early phase development. The issue isn't specialization; it's reset. When you see that program complexity increase in phase 1B or 2A, of course you need the depth of resources to support it. You've got more sites, you've got more subjects. But really, the question that's being overlooked is whether those resources will continue to layer on to the existing team, or are we replacing that team? If a phase 2 team is added under a sustained program lead who preserves that logic, risk calibration, you get both. You get the specialization and the continuity. Whereas on the other side, if the entire leadership team does reset, then you spend that entire startup period really rebuilding context before you actually get the benefit from the specialization you made the transition for. So sponsors really should expect their cake and eat it too. It's not an either or. It's whether they can partner with a CRO that can both scale with them and has the specialization while preserving that continuity in the leadership. Great question. Thanks, Janelle.
Here's another good question. If a program can pass an inspection with a newly assigned monitoring team, does continuity really matter?
Well, again, thank you to the audience for their engagement on this, and I'll take this. You know, passing an inspection only means that for a moment in time, I did what was minimally required. It doesn't make me a better performer in anything that I do. So from my view, an inspection only checks the box. And that is, again, that oversight met a regulatory standard and expectation. More importantly, though, continuity affects something earlier and much more strategic. It lays the important framework to ensure that proper timing and quality of risk detection is maintained throughout. When clinical monitoring teams are reset from project to project, there are no historians to provide background on the transfer of knowledge. Thus, teams are left to inefficiently reinvent the wheel and become totally dependent on process-driven approaches and historical documentation only. When monitoring teams are built that preserve continuity, however, they preserve and build upon established pattern foundations and recognition to ensure better data quality results and, more importantly, clinical trial outcomes. Again, you can still pass inspection with a full team reset. However, the path to get there will always include a few pitfalls: slower signal recognition, more conservative reanalysis and rework, additional governance friction, and increased sponsor oversight requirements. In summary, from my point of view, continuity is not about passing inspection. It is about optimizing outcomes that ultimately ensure proper oversight throughout an entire program, not just a singular study. So thank you again for that, Janelle.
All right, we have a fun one here that has been coming in a lot. Continuity sounds ideal, but people leave. How realistic is this long term?
I think I can take a stab at that one. Yeah, I mean, it's the industry reality. Turnover happens everywhere. But really, the key here is a CRO's structural resourcing model that enhances continuity, not relying on individual performance. I'll take DVCR, for example. At our organization, we anchor continuity at each critical level, whether it be at the executive leadership team, our program oversight, project managers, and clinical leads, and study managers. We ensure that we're really resourcing around continuity. So what does that mean? It really means that, workload changes, folks move into different roles or programs, but we intentionally retain those core resources to ensure we've got that program memory. It's a resourcing model built around sustained accountability. And really, that preservation allows for that recall of decision rationale, sponsor alignment, and it gives the sponsors the same escalation pathway. At early phase CROs that really succeed in this space, their resourcing model, again, is built around continuity, not individual performance. It's really embedded in the design, and it is the key to that, the success of that model. I'm not going to lie, it's challenging, but it is doable, again, if your resource model is built around continuity and it's your core pillar. Thanks, Janelle.
All right. Well, building on that, if continuity is so critical, why doesn't the industry universally operate this way?
Oh, it's hard, right? But in all reality, the industry really, more often than not, focuses on scalability or specialization in one therapeutic area or another. But again, as I had mentioned earlier, our sponsors should demand more. They should expect not only scalability and specialization, but also a model that is centered around continuity. Again, it's an intentional structural design for the organization, and not all CRO models prioritize that. It is frankly easier to scale headcount than to scale around the preserved program memory. So it's hard work. But as you can see from the presentation, that continuity really does have pay in dividends as we compound and accelerate that early phase development of those models.
All right, well, amazing. Thank you so much, Beth, Crystal, and Chris. And thank you to our audience for your active engagement. If we were not able to answer your specific question, we will do our best to follow up after the webinar. As a reminder, a recording of this session will be available on demand within 24 hours. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.